We seldom talk about economic abuse. There is a silence around it. Even though in the legal definition of family violence in Australia and in some other countries, economic abuse is seen as family violence. But for most of us, our idea of family violence is somebody beating us black and blue. I myself came to see money as abuse when I was interviewing a young woman whom I'll call Ekta. She was 27 and we were talking about money, migration and family. This was in 2010. She began crying when she was telling her story, and she told how she had done her graduate education in India. She had worked for a while in the finance sector, migrated in 2005 to Australia. But her single mother had bowed to the pressure of having her married off just before she came to Australia, the idea being she'd be too alone over here. The first few years of her marriage, first few months of her marriage were good. She soon learned that the man had married her because of her permanent resident visa. Ekta was the main earner. She looked after all the expenses of the household. Her husband sent all his earnings and some of hers without consultation to his family in India to build a luxurious home. It was the lack of care that made Ekta and her daughter, young daughter, leave the marriage within 3.5 years. He had already emptied the joint account. Ekta's story stayed with me because as a sociologist of money, I had studied remittances and seen remittances as a moral act, the sign of a filial child. I myself had sent money to my mother in India. But for Ekta, remittances had become a medium of abuse. I then connected the abuse of money with economic abuse and family violence only in 2016. The state of Victoria's Royal Commission into Family Violence, the final 8-volume report came out then. And it was there I read that economic abuse, denying a woman money, appropriating her assets, sabotaging her work, meant that this was economic abuse and economic abuse was family violence. Reading that report also kind of absolutely shook me because it changed my own version of myself. My first husband was a gambler, and I had always seen that as addiction, as family, as financial irresponsibility, even as emotional abandonment. But what I read in that report was gambling was an example of economic abuse. So I suddenly realized, much after the marriage was over, that I myself had suffered economic abuse, and it meant that I had suffered family violence. I'd never talked about it. It was as if it was something to be ashamed of, embarrassed about. One doesn't talk about money openly much of the time. But I had never anticipated that it would happen to me. Like Ekta, I also had graduate education in India and in the US and in Australia. I was financially independent like she was before marriage. I had never thought that I myself, because of migration and young children, would become financially dependent on my husband for a while. We all still do not talk about economic abuse as family violence. Part of it is that it's only the physical violence, the physical assault that is criminalized in Australia. I've been asked many times, why does a woman suffer economic abuse? Is it because she's submissive? Is it because she's financially illiterate? Ekta and I were neither of these things. Economic abuse is gendered. Most often, a man economically abusing a woman through money. As I said, it is denying a woman money, appropriating her assets, sabotaging her capability of paid work. And why does it happen? We know that patriarchy and gender inequality contributes to much of it. Men usually earn more than women. Men own more of the productive assets. There is a sense of male entitlement. The women we studied and interviewed for family violence and economic abuse, they also wondered why their husbands abused them through money. They abused them, took their money even when it was their savings, they were the main earners. Some thought that maybe it was because the husband himself had seen abuse as a child. Others thought maybe there was some mental problem there. In the end, they had more questions than answers. Economic abuse is also difficult to anticipate because there is no cultural practice that is associated with money that is necessarily abusive. Remittances are seen as a moral act. What happened with remittances with Ekta was that the man was using it without the morality associated with remittances. That means that you also have to look after your wife and child. This was a very major finding of the study, that money as a medium of care can become a medium of abuse if you use it without morality. I met Carol, who was a teacher, when she was 67 and had gone and come out of her second marriage. She's Anglo-Celtic, and in her culture, the joint account is at the center of what marriage means in terms of togetherness, in terms of partnership. So when she married again, she brought her savings of $60,000 and told her husband to put it into their joint account. He himself didn't have regular work. So for the first year, when she was not in regular teaching, all the money in the joint account was hers. Yet for the first year, she hardly had any money to spend. He had given her a credit card, but she told me she dared not spend it because he went through the statements and questioned her on every dollar. She was not able to give gifts from her own savings to her children. The emotional abuse attached to it was also accompanied by a fear of physical abuse. He had also sold her sewing machine. He had sold her roll-top desk that she loved without asking, even despite her protests. So she became really afraid of him. She told me she hid in a walk-in cupboard for 3 hours one day, thinking that maybe he's going to hit her now. She felt she was going crazy. After 2 years and a bit, she left, and he got more than half the house that she and her earnings had paid for. So money as a medium of care, the joint account as a medium of care, for her became a medium of surveillance, of coercive control. So coercive control is what Ekta and what Carol, they were experiencing. It is not just that there were some small differences or conflicts about money. Coercive control is a malicious, a malevolent pattern of continued abuse. It is gendered. As I said, it is more men doing it to women, but it is also gendered in that it uses gendered stereotypes. Women told us that the man would say, "I'm hitting you because you're not a good wife." He'd tell somebody else, "Oh, didn't your mother teach you how to cook?" He'd tell a woman, "You're so fat, so unattractive," using the gendered roles of mother and homemaker and partner. Most of them did not recognize this as economic abuse when it was happening to them. Part of coercive control is the man abuses you and then convinces you it's your fault. It's because you did something wrong. Time and again, the Indian and the Anglo-Celtic women that we spoke to, they said they were walking on eggshells. They never knew when this violence was going to descend upon them. He'd tell them that you are obsessive about money, and that's why I'm not giving you money. When he'd hit, he'd say it because you made me hit, it was your fault. They feared they were losing their mind. So coercive control is really a crime in that it takes away a woman's human rights and it takes away her freedom. When we spoke to the women, they said after they survived and left their marriage, they learned how to talk about money with their children, how to talk about family violence. They also learned how to talk to other women about money and economic abuse. Many of them went on to help women formally and informally. When they saw a woman in total despair, thinking she had lost herself, some of them would share their story in part. It was often too difficult, even after 20 years, to share their story in full. But they tell her that there will be a time when she will survive, when she will be financially resilient, and she will be able to make choices of the kind of life she wants to live. Learning from their stories, I came up with the concept of the relational literacy of money. It is not financial literacy that they lacked. It was the knowing how to talk about money. There are three aspects to this. First, you talk to your future partner about your story of money, how you've grown up, how you see yourself dealing with money, and you listen to his or her story of money. The second is to have a continual conversation about money across life stages. Many of these women were financially independent before having children, before migration. But it was the change of life stage, and they had not discussed how they would deal with the balance of your money, my money, and our money. When you retire, you need that conversation. Particularly with migration, you need that conversation because you come in touch with a cultural model of money that's different from yours. And the third is that you need to talk to your children about how to speak of money and intimate relationships. There is no single primer of money. Each person deals with money according to their own biography, and money shapes and is shaped by cultural values and social relationships. But we have to learn from each other how we have not succeeded and how we have succeeded with money. It's not very easy to talk to a future partner of money. It's private. It's also something that you fear, that it might unravel issues of power and dependence. But it's a red flag if you cannot talk to the person you want to spend your life with about money. And even if you do talk to that person, maybe you won't be heard. I learned this from Asha's story. She's a software developer. I met her when she was 27. She had reflected on money, partly because she was already sending money home to her parents when she was working. And she had moved to Australia to study and then work. She had also realized that she wanted more responsibility over money than her mother chose to have. So when she thought that they were going to get married, she spoke to her future husband, saying that she wants to continue sending money home, and maybe what they should do is to have a joint account where they would put in a specific amount of money, and each of them can do what they want with the rest of their money. And she told him that if this didn't work for him, they should reconsider the relationship. When they did get married, he told her, "You now belong to my family and your money is mine." She was the main earner. She said that one day she spent $2 on some papadum that came from her part of India. And he was very angry. He said, "You should have waited until we got to another suburb where it was less than $2. Emotional and physical violence followed. She realized, partly because of her own reflections on money, that what he wanted was control. Her marriage was over within the next 2 years. I learned about the need to discuss money across life stages from Enid. I met her a few times, but when we really did talk about money and economic abuse, she was 57 and into her second marriage. She had had 2 abusive relationships before. And she had decided that she was not going to live a life of subservience. But then she met a man with whom she could discuss money and who wanted to be equal. She was the main earner. And then when he was past 60, he felt he wanted to retire from paid work and look after the land that they had and produce fruit and vegetables. They sat down and decided how much money, they found out how much money they would have, and they worked out each other's needs, plus the needs perhaps of their adult children, and they worked out how much he would need, how much she would need, how much needs to go into their joint account. And so Enid said that every week she would directly credit the agreed amount to his account, and they'd work it out again if it didn't work. She was an excellent manager of money. She had put 8 children through Catholic schools despite the abuse and despite working part-time. And then to her horror, she found that one of her daughters was in danger of suffering economic abuse. She was good with money. She had learned how to be prudent, how to be transparent with money. She was financially independent before marriage and the first little bit of her marriage, but then they decided to have a child. She stopped paid work, but she had never asked her husband for money, and she didn't know how to talk about it. That's when she approached her mother, and her mother then learned that what her daughter had absorbed was from the early years of growing up, when she had seen her mother put herself last. She had also absorbed the good management and control of money, but she had not known the later insights of her mother of how to share money. And Enid told her daughter that she needed to discuss this balance of joint money and personal money now that they were in a different life stage. And you had to have this discussion, not just with respect, because there is something hierarchical about respect, but with unconditional mutual regard. So this story ended with hope. The women showed great courage in sharing their story of money. Most of them at one point or the other broke down. They said the trauma lasted. They were surprised themselves at how deep the hurt had been, and yet they shared the story, talking of their vulnerabilities, their despair, and their learnings. But they said they shared the story because some good might come of it. They said they hoped that with talking of money, their sons won't become perpetrators and their daughters won't suffer the absolute devastation of economic abuse. Thank you.